I'm going to spend a few minutes with you to just take up a little of this time and maybe be helpful and talk with you with what for the multifamily housing folks is becoming a real issue, and it is a fair housing issue. And so a little bit, I have just cobbled this together in the last few minutes, but what I want to do is I want to chat with you about hoarding. And that has a D in it. And the reason I point that out is that I was at a conference where I was speaking both in the morning and in the afternoon, breakout sessions, sort of like what we're doing this afternoon. And I mentioned at the close of my morning breakout, I said, and for those of you who maybe want to spend a little bit more time with me on topics, I will be doing another session this afternoon, and I'll be covering this, that, the other, and hoarding. And when I came back for the afternoon session, there were a whole lot of people. And I said, oh, I'm so excited that you all are here, and as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this, that, the other, and hoarding. And somebody raised their hand and said, hoarding? We thought you said whoring. And but it really is an important issue for the apartment industry. And I have a quick little pop quiz question. How many folks do you think in the United States today are affected by Alzheimer's disease? Anybody have an idea of that number? 5 million is, you know, if your price is right, you'd be a little too high, but you're close enough to count. It's right at about 4.5 million now. Now let's ask the question related to hoarding disorder. And there's an estimated range of folks who are afflicted by hoarding disorder. Anybody have any idea what that number might be? Try 6 to 15 million Americans affected with hoarding disorder. And you are fair housing folks, and as we know from listening, of course, this morning to Mr. Green, that disability is today the #1 practical issue and legal issue in the world of fair housing in terms of the number of complaints and lawsuits that are brought. Hoarding used to be a symptom. It used to be a symptom of other disabilities, an impactful scenario such as obsessive compulsive disorder. Coming up on about 2 years ago, May of 2003, the psychiatric, they're not an industry, but the psychiatric medical side of practice issued their new diagnostic service manual, and it doesn't come out every year, it only comes out episodically. And as of May 2013, hoarding became a disability in and of itself. And so what that means, of course, is that if it is a disability, then housing providers who have hoarders have the duty of reasonable accommodation. And so this is where it is becoming a huge issue. What I'm going to suggest is this, and you know what I didn't do before I always do when I'm doing a presentation? I didn't tell you that although, yes, I am an attorney, and yes, that I am proud to be with the company in the private sector that I serve as their in-house counsel, that when they let me out to talk, I come as a teacher, not a lawyer. It's education, not legal advice. So that means that anything that I share with you this morning, or for those of you who come to the breakout session I'm doing this afternoon, that it is not legal advice. And so if I do anything that messes up your life, you can't come back and sue me, and you can't come back and sue all the fine organizations that have put this great conference together for you. So I didn't do my starting out caveat, but I want to do it now because I want to tell you what I tell the industry is the worst thing that they can do when they have a hoarder, and that is to look at their lease and send a nasty gram to that resident and say, you're in violation of the lease, you know, cite whatever paragraph or item number, and you have whatever, 3 days to clean this up, you know, 2 days to stop this, you know, whatever, the typical cease and desist or whatever you call it here in Tennessee. I'm not from Tennessee. But you cannot just start that landlord-tenant process because of the duty to reasonably accommodate. And so I sometimes get the question, well, okay, but how do we even know that it's hoarding? You know, what's the difference between a collector and a hoarder? And generally, it's about the situation of control. A collector can control the situation, or hoarder cannot. And quite frankly, you're going to know when it's a hoarder. And so what I tell the industry, what I tell the multi-housing providers is this: when you walk into that unit, that apartment unit, and you have that OMG moment, you take off your landlord-tenant hat and you step back and you say, what would somebody who's maybe not a landlord at all say when they saw this? And if you think that most people would say, oh goodness, that's a hoarder, then you've got a hoarder. Because in fair housing, a person does not have to have a disability to have their civil rights protection under the disability handicap provision of the Fair Housing Act. They have to have a record of it, that's another way, or they can be perceived as having it. And so once anybody has that OMG moment looking at a unit, it doesn't really matter what kind of formal diagnosis is in place. That person, if you think, oh gosh, they must be a hoarder, I think they're a hoarder, I think this is hoarding, that housing provider has now by definition put that person in the protected class. And so the challenge now, of course, is for the industry to work through that, and work through that so that there won't be the times that most of you in this room who advocate for people in the fair housing world and for people with disabilities will have to intervene. And so I'm just going to talk about and throw out some issues that are out there, but here's the big important message to people who are the housing providers. The message to them is that it is a disability and you have the duty, as you do for each and every disability, to reasonably accommodate. And so the message is they do not go to the lease and go, well, our lease says, and start the lease process, the eviction process, the notice process, but rather they need to have that interactive dialogue with the person. And then they have a duty under the law to engage in extreme efforts to create a remedial plan. And the remedial plan must be specific. You can't just say, oh, clean it up. And you have X many days to do it. With hoarders, in particular, it has to be made manageable. And the goal that is the most important goal of all is for the housing provider to keep that resident. That is the message that those of us who teach within the industry share on the topic of hoarding. Your goal is to keep the resident. And that should be communicated to the resident. There's an issue here, there's a problem here, but we want, if at all possible, to have you continue as a resident at our community, at our property. And so you start establishing very specific goals. The goals need to be stack ranked. And I'm going to tell you right now, for the housing providers, that unit will never be as perfect as they want it to be. But what they can do is they can work toward improving the areas that are health and safety related. So you give very, very specific goals to the person in that plan. It may be that between now and next week, we need at least to have a space cleared throughout the unit where you could be rescued if someone had to come, like an EMT, because you had a medical emergency. They need to be able to bring that stretcher in here in an emergency. We wouldn't want you to be caught in that situation where you could not be removed quickly in a situation unrelated to the hoarding. But because of the hoarding, the rescue people couldn't come in. The goal might be very specific to say that all of the appliances and heating sources, that there must be space around them so that they can be used for their intended purposes. Because what happens is if people start accumulating to the point of hoarding, a lot of times within that unit they will have walled off their stove, or they will have walled off the thermostat, or they will have walled off if they have some sort of space heaters. And in that context, then, they still need to cook, They still need to heat. A lot of times they will bring something like sterno into the environment, and then you not only have the health issue or the safety issue with sterno, you have it in an environment that is highly inflammatory. And so the idea is to look very specifically at the issues and what you need done, and then you set it out in writing, and then you get the person to sign it. And you have dates where you're going to come back in and you're going to check things out. And I tell the housing providers it's not going to be a smooth trajectory. There will be sometimes an absolute desire and intent on the part of the hoarder to make it better, but they sometimes can't, or they will for a while and then they will go back into the challenge. And so it is an ongoing dialogue that sometimes can take not just days, but weeks and months. And so I'm going to give some practical tips that are out there for housing providers, and if you are ever advocating on behalf of a hoarder, these are some ideas to bring to the table as well. You have that hoarder, and at this moment in time, they're kind of with you on the plan. They're doing the, okay, you're right, maybe I can get rid of some of this, and and I'll work with you on that. But they live perhaps in an apartment or in some other, form of housing that is unit-based, and where are they going to take it? Okay? Think about making sure, if you're the housing provider, or suggesting to the housing provider that they may want to bring in an extra dumpster for that particular stretch of time. So the person, if it's like dumpster pickup is 2 days a week or 1 day a week, and they just, they're, it's like day number 6, but there's no place today for the person to put their stuff. Other people who deal with hoarders have suggested to the housing providers that they actually invest in renting a truck for part of the day. And then you can get into the issue of, from a reasonable accommodation cost standpoint, who pays for that. But the idea being that it is not only good to get it out of the unit, it is good to get it away from the hoarder, because sometimes they will, with all good intent, put stuff in the dumpster. But if it's the early part of the cycle and the dumpster stuff isn't going to be picked up for 2 or 3 or 4 days, they may go back out later to retrieve it. Again, simply because this is a disability. It is a compulsion and they cannot help it. And so think about that kind of issue. The important thing also is to recognize that this is a disability, but also that it deserves respect. We have this sort of inclination when we see someone who is hoarding to look and say, oh my gosh, you should see that unit. There is just so much trash. There's just so much garbage. There's just so much crap in there. I'm not so sure I was supposed to say crap, but I did. And so, but that is not the terminology to use. I heard the story about someone who was dealing with a hoarder, and they had this absolutely beat up, torn recliner chair that didn't recline. And the housing provider said, like, for example, you could get rid of this, this old beat up, recliner. Why would you even need to have this recliner? And the reason was that the person said, I can't give that up because that is the chair that my mother died in. She always sat in that chair, and that was her chair. And you know what? I wear my grandmother's ring. It's not particularly a, valuable ring. It's not like the inheritance of all time. But it's a pretty little stone, and sometimes people will say to me, oh, I like your ring. It's so pretty. And that gives me that moment to say thank you and then to remember my grandmother. Society says this little ring is okay, but understand that it's not so much different for that person who had that recliner that was all about their mother. So the understanding to be compassionate, and while it may be junk and trash to a housing provider and a challenge for the landlord-tenant relationship with that housing provider, it still is something that may be important to the person. So part of that is to advocate through that. Some other ideas that are out there is that for the housing providers to always make sure that their staff understands that. I'm putting this as sort of a potpourri, sort of like just not a summarized checklist. But one of the other things I'm going to encourage the housing providers to do, and then I'm going to talk about what you could do and some privacy issues, is that this is where housing providers need to have a lawyer that actually understands fair housing and particularly disability and particularly this subset of hoarding that we're chatting about at this moment in time. We talk with housing providers, those of us who teach them, and we say, you may have the best closing attorney on the planet. You may have the best landlord-tenant attorney on the planet. You may have the best whatever attorney on the planet for premises liability. You know, somebody drowns in the swimming pool, this is the lawyer with the insurance company. You know, you've got great counsel, but this is such a specialty area that there's a need both from the advocacy side and from the property management side to know what the resources are. And that takes me to the issue of resources. And one of the challenges for multi-housing family folks, and even for you as advocates, is the privacy issue. Is when can a housing provider reach out perhaps to an outside organization that deals or works with people with hoarding disability? And you have to be very careful. It can even be as simple as when can that housing provider actually contact someone on the emergency list? What happens when the housing provider is a senior housing community and the hoarder is a senior, and there's all of the different issues going on with the senior, and they don't want their adult children to be notified? And so what I am encouraging multifamily folks to do is to change that emergency contact form to be something else. I've decided they didn't need another form. For those of you who get involved in the landlord-tenant situation, there is so much paperwork out there. There is now more paperwork in renting an apartment in America than there is in buying a home. And so I've learned that the last thing I should ever say when I'm in front of a multifamily housing audience is, you know, you ought to have another form to do this. So what I've decided was I can tell them, you already have, like, how many of you who are multifamily housing have emergency contact forms? And they all raise their hands. And then I say to them, cool, we're going to use the same form, we're just going to change it a little bit. And so what I'm suggesting to the industry is that form become an emergency and other issue form, where it's anything that might affect the right for the resident to stay. And it's sort of an opt-in at the time that they're signing up on the lease and going through that paperwork process as a new resident. And it's sort of like, you know, if there's ever any issue that might affect my right to continue to live here, I hereby give permission to the following people to be contacted. And then the same thing for the landlord to reach out to organizations or individuals that may, you know, be able to benefit the situation on my behalf. And at that point in time, there's not that much resistance to filling it out because there's no issue going on. And that way, because sometimes these things, as challenges as they are, they really do not meet the definition of an emergency. And it would concern me to have multifamily people getting in trouble because of the issue of privacy of their residents. Just because I have a hoarder doesn't mean that I can call some organization and report them. And so that is something that, you know, to be thinking about and as you all advocate. And I think one of the things I want to say while I'm up here, and I've had this discussion with Tracy, I teach the people who want to do it right. And sometimes people look at those of us who teach within multifamily housing, and we look at it as an us or them kind of thing. I'm in a room full of advocates. I'm in a room full of people who bring complaints and charges through the system against the people in my industry. But what I've learned through the years is we are all on the same page for the most part. We heard horror stories, just the evil that is still out there, some of the, you know, things that, you know, have been shared with us already this morning. But I can assure you that most of the housing providers that are out there want to do it well. I see them on average of about once a week, because right now, in the last many years, I've been doing about 50 to 60 presentations within the industry a year. That averages out to one a week. And these people come not because you're making them, they're coming because they want to do a good job. And so understand that, and the more that we can understand the issues like hoarding, and be informed and educated on it, we can put it together more in terms of what can we do at the end of the day, the industry and the advocates, to make it more likely that someone will continue to have their housing, and particularly in the area of disability, and now, of course, to some extent in this industry issue of hoarding. And it is so real. I have to tell a story that, and I will not tell you who it was. It is someone actually in multifamily housing who is very, very well known. And this person is also involved in major property management. And I actually saw the photos from this particular hoarding situation. And so the issue was that they had a resident. He was a lawyer. It sounds like one of those jokes. There was a resident, he was a lawyer. Absolutely, well-groomed, just distinguished, great resident, rent paid on time, all of the time. No issues, nothing going on, went to work every day. They saw him with his briefcase going, they saw him coming back. Maintenance went in little footnote, a lot of times this is how you will find out you have a hoarder. A lot of times they won't call for a maintenance issue because they know what they're doing is a challenge and they don't want you to know. But sometimes maintenance will go in. It may be something like, with the exterminator for, bug issues. Somebody went into the unit legitimately and discovered that there was a hoarder. And it was this lawyer, and he was hoarding only one thing. And what he was hoarding, and I saw the photos, and the closets were filled, the cupboards were filled. He was hoarding jar after jar after jar of his urine. I am the before lunch speaker. Yes. And so it is an amazing disability. It's one that needs to be treated with respect, but what we need to keep our minds open on is that this is truly a fair housing issue, but one where it's going to need a lot of finesse in handling it. Something unrelated that has popped into my head was another one of those practical tips. I have been told that sometimes with hoarders, if they can have their closet doors and their cupboard doors removed and stored, that sometimes they have anxiety because things are hidden behind cupboards and closets, and that contributes more to the hoarding, whereas if they can see what is around them, it works a little bit better for them. So just another one of those little tips that may or may not ever work if you are ever sitting on the table side representing a hoarder and advocating for that hoarder, the different ways to make it happen. I would be glad, before I close with some words, I want to reference Dr. Glover in a moment because she referenced along these lines. But before I do that, I can't promise that I can answer a whole lot of questions. I think something like Adult Family Services is a resource, but again, it just so concerns me in terms of the intrusion. Now we're talking government, and whether it's government housing or not government housing, it's that intrusion, and I just worry that, what I worry about is when you have those adult children that have, and I see this in senior housing a lot, and some of you probably have seen this yourself, a lot of those older residents are pretty well abandoned in their housing scenarios. You call that adult child and say there's an issue, and they're like, ain't my problem, don't bother me. But oh my goodness, if you were to call adult, protective services, and they get wind of that, now they're at, how dare you call that on behalf of my beloved mother, And so, is it a resource? Yes. One of the things I am encouraging the industry to do is find those resources today before you open the door to a unit and find that you've got a hoarder. Who are some of the lawyers out there that, would be good to give you some guidance? Who are some of the groups that are even like in a room like this that would work with a sincere landlord in trying to resolve issues? But identifying those groups, identifying, perhaps some of the organizations that are out there. I'm beginning to think that eventually we will see things just like we see, like programs, for, Alcoholics Anonymous, that we see, for different support groups. Are there support groups out there for there? What are the advantages and disadvantages to that? But coming up with a list as a housing provider and as an advocate of where you go, because part of the challenge you're going to have as advocates is that you're not particularly, aware of this or astute in this yet yourselves. So what are the resources? And wouldn't it be neat if both the housing providers and the advocates for the residents could work together on this? Thank you for that question. Anybody else just with a question? And that's a good question. How much time is enough time? And it reminds me of the question that those of us who teach sometimes get. Well, what is reasonable? You must reasonably accommodate. What is reasonable? And I always tell folks that if I knew what reasonable was, and my husband's going to tell you I don't, if I knew what reasonable was, I could write my own ticket anywhere. Every scenario of reasonable accommodation, not just the ones related to hoarding, are absolutely fact-specific. So there is absolutely nothing where I can say that, if you give them a week or if you give them a month or you need to give them 6 months, I can't give you that answer because it is going to be so dependent on the situation. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, the final arbiter of what is a reasonable period of time is going to be a judge and a jury. It's not going to be the housing provider, it's not going to be the hoarder, and it's not going to be the advocacy, because reasonable accommodation is defined if it can't be worked out ultimately within the courtroom or the administrative process. And so I wish I could give you that answer. In looking at some of the memos that are out there and some of the dialogue that's going on out there, I will tell you that it could go on for weeks, if not months, and particularly because you're doing it in steps and you're going to have relapses. And so the message is, when I am talking to the housing providers, my message is that before you make that person leave, truly, truly believe that you have done everything and anything you can to keep that person as the resident, because yet again, that is the goal. I wish I had the wonderful answer to say to you, I think anything between 36 hours and, 2 weeks is perfect, and it's not, and it's not. Any other questions? No, okay, I get this as well from multi-housing folks. They do according to our Landlord Tenant Act, and somebody in here help me with Tennessee Landlord Tenant Act. Most states have the idea that you don't have to give a reason for a non-renewal. And so mistakenly, housing providers think that means that you don't have to renew someone because you don't like what they're doing related to disability. And the issue is that you don't have to tell them. In fact, from a business standpoint, it's not good to get into the dialogue of why you don't renew a lease, why a housing provider doesn't renew a lease, because then you just get, let's say they've been playing their music loud all the time, and you say, we've had too many noise complaints, and they go, well, then I'll be more quiet, so it's just not a good dialogue. But here's what happens. If and when anyone who is non-renewed comes into the arena and says, I believe that I was not renewed because of any protection under fair housing, and in this case, my disability of hoarding, then it absolutely goes to the housing provider to be able to show a legitimate reason unrelated to the disability as to why that lease was not renewed. So let's say that the person was not very good about paying rent, okay? And they were behind all the time and late all the time, and finally the landlord just said, you know what, if they're going to complete their lease at the end, we can't keep begging for money and all the rest of this. But the person goes and says, well, they didn't renew my lease because I'm Polish. They didn't know I was Polish when I moved in here. They know it's now, and they didn't renew my lease because it's Polish. Then that housing provider has got to show No, it had nothing to do with, whether we found out they were Polish or not. It had to do with the rental history payment or the noise complaints, And so just letting the lease complete and then the housing provider saying, and now we don't have to keep them anymore, would be a fair housing violation. So good question on that one as well. Anyone else with a question? Well, first of all, the issue is, and it's a good question, what do you do when you have that elderly person whose situation is the person is diminishing to the point where most people would say probably now almost to a disabling, level. But the issue is, why do you care? And my point is that if the rent is still being paid on time, the person is not breaking any rules, still is taking care, we're coming a little away from the hoarding, still taking good care of the unit, and there really are no landlord-tenant issues, then sometimes it's very difficult because housing providers have to step back from what you want to do from your heart and what you need to do. But if you've got the scenarios where the person is at risk, then you make a risk management business decision in terms of, do you call the authorities, do you call, to Tracy's point, do you call Adult Protective Services because they're the ones with the expertise to deal with it, and then you take the risk of the flack later, and that's going to be a decision that you're going to have to make, again with guidance with someone who understands the nuance and the importance of disability as an issue in fair housing. This is not easy stuff. I sometimes do beat up on the senior housing folks. It was like, okay, you guys didn't want to have people with children, now deal with the parking. Yeah, but that's a story and a topic for yet another day. Anything else before I close this little impromptu session down? Then I want to reflect on something that Dr. Glover said, and she mentioned Thurgood Marshall and the role that law and legislation plays in making things better in our society. But it isn't just the laws and the regulations. Justice Marshall was asked once upon a time to comment on the intent and value of laws, of legislation. And he was not speaking to the housing industry, but he could have been, because here's what he said. He said, there is legislation that can be used and is used every day to open doors. And there is legislation that can be used and is used every day to remove obstacles. But there is no law, there is no legislation that can build bridges. That job belongs to you and to me. Thank you.